Hello, everybody. Good morning. I hope everybody is having a good Labor Day. As we start week 2, I wanted to include the video for this week. And before I go and talk about psychoanalysis, let me go back to chapter 3 because last week I didn't really talk about it much. I guess most of the video was kind of the introduction. So let me go back. Um, Corey talked about ethics, and this is a big realm. I think as the counseling theories, one thing that I want everybody to keep in mind is um, kind of the aspirational ethics. And what that means is going beyond the non-maleficence, kind of the benefits of being a counselor, and that's why things like consultation and supervision are so important, especially for beginning counselors who might not have the background of or really the experience that a experienced counselor would have. So be sure to understand some of those points that Corey mentioned. Also, I know in the introduction, a lot of students, well, not a lot, but some students mentioned that they had gone through some personal struggles themselves. Thank you to those that were open and shared that. I think that's really powerful. I myself have gone through some personal struggles, and I myself have sought out counseling. Um, just our job, whether you're a teacher or a emergency certified counselor, that's a lot of stress. And how are you going to manage that? How are your coping skills, and how are your professionalism, your mannerism in those tough times? Because the it's very easy to get provoked, to lose that professional aspect. So I mean, just at the personal level, I would highly encourage, um, you know, everybody really to seek out counseling for themselves. EAPs are great, um, and that stands for Employee Assistant Programs. Um, most schools have them, um, and as far as chapter 3 goes, make sure you understand kind of what informed consent is, even at the school level. It's always good practice to inform parents before a child is being pulled or is being you work with that child. Also, understand the importance of confidentiality. That's super important for any counselor. And going back to, you'll learn more about some of these cases in other courses, but cases like Terrasoft and breaking confidentiality, that's really important. And another thing, especially nowadays, the technology, LPCs. Um, I know LPCs that do sessions over Skype or other video chats. Kind of what are the implications? What does that look like? And how's the profession dealing with that? Sure, it's convenience, much like these online classes are convenient, but they do have some ethical guidelines and some ethical issues. So, just keep that in mind because technology changes. Um, I remember when the first iPhone came out, and now, we have so much technology, so much power, but, how, as the profession, how are we supporting that technology or using that appropriately? Um, Multicultural, I think we talked about briefly at the last video. Be sure you understand the importance of not only the culture, but the geographics, the religious perspectives, and that's very hard, because we all have biases, we all have internal struggles, and that's why counseling is so important. I can personally share that growing up in Little Mexico, we were next to the LGBT community, and in the 90s, the AIDS epidemics was going on, and there was a lot of just really bias, um, from even my parents that kind of in turn I would say I grew up with, and it wasn't until I was able to reflect on that um, it really I really started to understand those biases. So be sure to kind of read up on it and understand kind of how multicultural issues can affect the counselor. Also, um, when we talk about assessment and diagnosis, culture plays a big role. So be sure to understand how cultural is intertwined with how people um, kind of take an assessment or diagnosis. I can tell you in the schools, a lot of times it is very difficult for a parent to hear a diagnosis such as dyslexia, autism, because culturally, um, it's not something that they understand or that they really accept. So that's something that as a counselor, um, you can help facilitate and help parents navigate some of those very tough issues. Um, also evidence-based practices. That is a big thing in kind of case management, the insurance world, and even the schools. Does your theory, does your technique, does your intervention, is it backed by research? Can you, as a counselor, look at the literature and say, I applied this technique, and based on the research, the literature, this technique has evidence that it's a proper technique to use. So be sure you kind of understand that, and be sure you understand how kind of an ethical counselor would apply certain theories in certain situations. Okay, now moving on to chapter 4. Here we're going to talk about psychoanalysis. And the first thing that many people hear when they take that intro to psychology in undergrad, or, that even kind of in the media, that first thing that they hear is Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud was really the catalyst for the field of behavioral sciences. And again, we're talking about the 1800s. This is in Vienna, which is kind of the birthplace of psychology. That's kind of where the three schools of psychology came from when we talk about first school being Sigmund psychoanalysis, second school Alfred Adler, third school kind of the existential Frankel movement, Royal May. But when we specifically talk about psychoanalysis, I want you to understand that Sigmund Freud kind of created that structure, and that's what the field needed at the time. He created the Society of Psychoanalysis, um, and in that society, he created almost like a hierarchy where he was the president. He had his board of directors. The board of directors had the supervisors, and then the supervisors had the trainees. And all over Europe, doctors, psychiatrists would go to Vienna and train under the psychoanalysis technique. So if you look at ACA, American Counseling Association, TCA, Texas Counseling Association, APA, American Psychological Association, all those organizations now are actually very similar to what Sigmund Freud created in Vienna, that structure. So I think more than his theory, more than his ideas, that structure was kind of what set the tone that we even see now with our professional organizations, where you have the president, you have the board of directors, you have all the, for example, TCA, LPC supervisors. Below them, you have the LPCs, and then below that, you have the LPC interns, and then below that, you have master students. And I think that's really important for the profession, because not only did it give the profession credibility, but it also standardized the profession. So Sigmund Freud's books, his techniques, it created a certain standard in the field of psychoanalysis that had never existed before him. So I think more than his ideas, more than his theory, that structure that he created was very powerful for our helping professions in the field of not only our profession, counseling, but the psychology as well as the social work profession. So be sure you understand that. The book didn't really explain that, but I think, to me, that structure was super important for our field even today. I mean, I look at the TCA and how they're structured, and that's kind of what I see. So be sure that you understand kind of how Freud viewed human nature in a very deterministic manner, and this is opposite of Alfred Adler, which we'll talk about next. But he really emphasized that deterministic viewpoint, and I think that's really important because that's kind of how his technique developed. So he identified the three the stages: the id, the ego, the superego. Be sure you kind of know the difference of that. And he developed those ego defense mechanisms and the coping strategies. So if kind of as an LPC, one of the things that I even see now for people experiencing, the big two, depression and anxiety, is how do they cope? And even as a LPC myself, I see a lot of these coping strategies that people use and the kind of maladaptive behavior. And Freud was really the first person to explore those, and I think that's very powerful. He kind of set the bar. He kind of set the standard for those defense mechanisms that even now are clearly visible in clients. Childhood development. That was, something that psychoanalysis really explored. How does how does the first years of development affect an adult? And I think that's really important. Even part of an intake. When I look at kind of the intake forms, I usually ask about childhood and if they've experienced any childhood trauma or any drastic changes in childhood, because a lot of that is part of the individual. So Freud was really the first person to look at that and really explore that and kind of look at the different stages of development. So, be sure you understand the stages. Eric Erickson, Dr. Corey talked about him, and especially my school counselors. Be sure you understand the Eric Erickson as well as Freud's development stages. They're really important. In schools, Eric Erickson is big, and um, with the developmental counseling course, you'll learn more about him. But I think it's good to know the stages and be familiar with um, kind of what each of those stages look like. Um, Another thing that psychoanalysis um, or Freud talked about was the idea of transference and countertransference. If you're working in the schools or in a community setting, um, the client as well as yourself, you can work with the client. I mean, looking back at some of my experience, I can look back at some of my clients and they reminded me maybe of my own family members or maybe a past, girlfriend. And that can really impact the professional relationship, especially if you're not aware of what's happening. And I think Freud um, did, his theory, part of that is to really explore how one affects the other. In his book, he really goes into detail and he actually talks about that flow of energy that I think really happens in counseling, especially working with some of the more verbal clients. You're going to identify a lot, or even the client might identify and may, think that you're a past lover, a past classmate, and some of that projection or anger or those feelings might come out, and that really needs to be explored. Um, I can tell you, I've had a female client that has, um, really had a physical attraction, and kind of offered to kind of intimacy. And if I'm not professional or if I kind of go along with it, um, going back to being an ethical counselor, that's not right. And the number one violation is having inappropriate relationships with clients. So, be sure you understand transference and countertransference. That's all, um, very important. Free association. There's kind of that caricature of Freud sitting in the back and the client in the couch laying down, um, talking about ideas. Be sure you understand what that is and kind of how that looks like. Interpretation. Freud did a lot of interpreting, and actually, we don't have time to talk about it, but dream analysis. That's a field that is actually starting to become more and more popular. The kind I call them the Jungians. There's various books on dream analysis. I actually know a good friend of mine who's a LPC, and she has her own private practice, and she does dream analysis. I don't specialize in that, but from what she's told me, a lot of people or a lot of clients are interested in that. And, if that's something that interests you, and you're wanting to set up a private practice, there's definitely some resources to learn more about that and some trainings. I believe she's certified in dream analysis, and there's great resources for that. So there definitely is a market for dream analysis, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, again, I don't know much about it, but the little that I know, there's different kind of images, and those images represent certain things, and um, it can kind of give you maybe a perspective that you didn't understand previously. So, that's just, I guess, for this level of course, just make sure you are familiar with Jung and the dream analysis. And also, I know the psychoanalysis is the oldest theory, but just be familiar with how it has changed. The object relations, um, that's kind of more of a modern twist to psychoanalysis, and a lot of techniques, I think or at least I've used some of the object relations techniques. There was a book that came out in the 70s, that's called The Games We Play, and it talks about different things, different games, different um, kind of maneuvers that people have done, and it's a really interesting book. So that's part of object relations, which is kind of a spin from psychoanalysis. So make sure that you kind of understand some of the importance of Freud. His theory did have some things that honestly I find sexist or racist, but this theory is from the mid 1800s, so I think relative to the time, um, that's probably expected. Also, some of the limitations, um, true psychoanalysis did take a lot of time. It's probably not as organized as some of the other theories. It's probably not evidence based as some of the other theories. But regardless of that, I think the importance of that was a historical aspect, and the fact that Freud really created that structure for the profession that really it needed, and even now we see. So I'm going to split this video into two parts. That way my loading time won't be so long. And next video I will talk about Alfred Adler.